Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas, and how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome to the next 100. This is episode 101. It's good to be back with you guys. We've got another great episode.
Tables or crews.
Welcome to the next 100. This is episode 101. It's good to be back with you guys. We've got another great episode. Today's topic comes from Cody Ford.
Yes, today's topic is on understanding an unfamiliar database. And his comment was, how about a podcast on tips and techniques to understand an unfamiliar database, such as viewing and understanding dependencies of tables or creating database diagrams, and any other tips to come up to speed on an unfamiliar database, besides the knowledge transfer from other employees, because you don't always have that available.
Exactly. So that's going to be our topic today. And thanks, Cody, for that suggestion. And I guess one of the things that we will point out now is that, so this is going to be kind of on the investigative side versus the best practices side, right? So more of, I just need to get the information, so I need to figure out what, if anything, to change. Or on our podcast, first, we want to thank Kevin Fiesel for all of his help with episode 100. I know we enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. And so thanks, Kevin, for taking a little bit of time to chat with us again.
Should we phrase that as thanks, Kevin, for having us on your podcast?
Yes. We want our podcast back.
Yes. That was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. So we appreciate that. And of course, all the user comments, right? Those who contributed questions, we're appreciative for that.
Yep.
We do have a couple of other shout outs that came to us via LinkedIn.
Yep. And I think some of these came from on episode 99 where we started asking people to connect on LinkedIn in addition to Twitter. And
right.
The first one came from Jack Rose. And he said, after hungrily devouring your wonderful SQL Data Partners podcast for months, episode 99 finally inspired me to reach out to you as instructed there. Not sure you're
reaching out, right?
To reach out to you as instructed there. Not sure you intended listeners to simply follow you or actually connect personally, so I'm trying both. Inspiring work.
Yeah, so thanks, Jack, for listening. We appreciate you reaching out, right? You know, it's funny, the combination, and that was purely by accident, right? Kind of that combination of both asking for people to reach out on LinkedIn and the imposter syndrome. But there was a very high correlation. A number of people mentioned that episode and like, well, I've thought about reaching out before, but now after that episode, I'll do it.
Yep. And we had another comment from LinkedIn from Chris Albert.
Yeah, so he says, I've been listening to the podcast for the last couple of months and love the show. Sad to say, I've already gone through the whole back catalog of episodes during my commute, but he'll keep tuning in. So thanks, Chris, for tuning in. It is unfortunate that we managed to get through the back catalog so quickly. Thanks for hanging in there. I know we're going to keep chugging along.
I joined the podcast on episode 50. I had not listened to all of the previous episodes, and I went back and listened to all of them as well. And I know it was a little bit sad when I got to the end too. So, but we've got new ones every week. So
that's right. We're going to keep chugging along here, and we make it the commitment for another year. So we're glad that you're sticking around.
Yep.
Okay, so the URL for today's episode is going to be SQLDataPartners.com/newdb.
Or SQLDataPartners.com/101.
Okay, so ultimately, again, the topic for today is becoming familiar with an unfamiliar database. And there's really two tacks or ways to kind of go about this. And I know Cody kind of specifically mentioned an individual database. We're going to attack this first from an instance level, right? So this is the scenario, again, where you're either new to a new job. Maybe for whatever reason, a database was stood up. Maybe for whatever reason, a database was stood up, another department. and now all of a sudden you're asked to take it over. You're consulting, what have you. So instead of focusing just at the database, we're going to take a look first at a couple of things on the instance level, and then we'll circle back to any kind of specific database things.
So the first area that we usually take a look at is system availability, because those are the kind of things that if you're suddenly responsible for this, those are the kind of things you could lose your job over.
That's right. Or get calls in the night about, right? All those things. You're like, okay, well, let me kind of nip this stuff in the bud in the beginning.
Yep. So the foremost one there that I usually look at is backups, because things happen and there's going to come a time that you need to use your backup. And there's a lot of different ways that people attempt to do backups that aren't always the greatest when you come to restore time.
Exactly.
Running every day.
Well, right. There's a lot of ways to script a lot of these things out. And we're going to be talking about database SelfMonitor and how this can help us with a lot of this as well. But first, we're going to dig into kind of the why around what we're doing here.
Yep.
And so with the backups, some of the things that we want to know, one is, are they happening? And then where they're going.
That where they're going can be a pretty key thing, because sometimes you take a look and say, oh, backups running every day, but they're going to the C drive.
Right.
Not always a good thing to do. Other times they're going to a network share that gets purged every night or moved somewhere that as a DBA, you don't have access to wherever they're getting moved to.
Right. A lot of times that location also depends on how long we can keep those databases around. Right. So inevitably we may have to do cleanup because of a disk size issue, when in reality we need to keep those databases.
A lot of hot water behind keeping them around longer is that there's a lot of things that can happen that you may not catch or may not notice for a few days to a week, or even a couple weeks. And if you've only got 3 or 4 days worth of backups and you find a problem that you need to pull some data out of a backup from 2 weeks ago, but you don't know about it until it's already past that retention window, you could be in a lot of hot water there.
Yeah, you could be in trouble.
Yep.
And the last component we want to talk about there is, which kind of goes along with our next component, we'll jump into file recovery options. But so what type of backups are we doing here, right? And so when we think about file recovery, right, we're thinking about full or simple. I mean, bulk logged, I don't see a lot of people using that on the long term. That's kind of more of a short term type thing. But so for full or simple, what are we doing with the backups for the databases? Sure. Full or simple, what are we doing with the backups for the databases based on the file recovery setting?
Yes. And I think that the thing I see is oftentimes if you've just installed a database with an application or something like that, oftentimes you're not getting it in the right recovery model to be able to meet your expectations on the recovery time or recovery point objectives.
Sure.
And I think when we talk about recovery options, I mean, you can have your opinion on whether simple recovery or full recovery models are better, but it really comes down to what are the recovery time and recovery point objectives that you're trying to meet there, and do those options that it's currently configured for meet what you're looking for?
No, exactly. A lot of times we'll see databases, in full recovery model, but then and so again, this is just information collecting. Now we're going to get this information and we're going to figure out, okay, well, this sounds like an issue, right? We go have the discussions to go figure out what it needs to be, but this is the first areas we want to check.
Yep. Yeah, and I think funny, or maybe not funny story, but an interesting story there that I came across a few years ago on some confusion over the recovery model option was that somebody had a database that was basically working. This was a company I worked for several years ago, but it was basically working as a queue in that data would get thrown into it, and then another process would grab the data out of that and move it somewhere else. And it was one of those things that it never got backed up because it never had any data in it for a long period of time.
Yeah, quote unquote, yeah.
Yeah. However, and it was true because data would very rarely reside in that database for longer than 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And it was a SQL Express database. It was set to full recovery model, and it had been running for about 4 years. of without ever having a backup on it. And eventually, the problem we ran into, you want to guess what the problem was, Carlos?
Probably ran out of disk space.
We ran out of disk space. And this was a database that I'd never even known was in use with this company prior to running out of disk space. But they called me and said, well, it's out of disk space. Why is SQL Server being such a pig? Well, it's because it wasn't configured correctly. And so that was when we had to flip it over to simple recovery model and then shrink the files down, or the log files down. They had plenty of disk space, leave it in simple recovery mode, and never had a problem again. And that was a scenario where simple recovery model was the right way to do it. And it was also an environment where it didn't really need backups because data was never there longer than 5 minutes.
There you go. The other components of system availability are going to be, The other components of system availability are going to be disk space, which you just kind of talked about, right? How much do I have left? And then the DBCC check DBs, right? Are they being run on a regular basis? Lots of ways to go about checking that. But again, that's just information that we want to grab.
So why is it important to run CheckDB regularly, Carlos?
See, we could devote multiple podcast episodes to this very question, Steve.
And in fact, we have, haven't we?
We have devoted a couple. That's right. Yeah. But ultimately, looking for corruption there. And I know that I'm just going to leave it at that, because if we go further, Steve, I know you'll want to take the whole episode just on that point.
Okay.
So the next section then is admin setup, right? So kind of how are things set up from an administrative type perspective? So some of the things that I'm looking there are, what are the agent jobs? Who are the owners? And who are the operators of the system? Do we have mail set up? And am I going to get notifications for the jobs? Right. So a couple of things there, right? We have to make sure that the mail profile is set up, the email can flow out of the system. I'm looking at those jobs. What notifications, if any, do I need on them? Does it matter, right? Maybe, again, these are just questions. I'm collecting this information, and then I want to be able to go back to the business and say, look, what needs to get changed here?
Yep. Another one that I check around, not just the job owners, but as far as the SQL Server services for SQL Server and SQL Server Agent,
right?
Who are those running as?
Yep.
And that's one that I've seen that sometimes you look and you realize, oh, that SQL Server is running as a domain user account of an employee that left 6 months ago. And recently, somebody in the IT department,
server settings here,
you restart SQL Server, it may not restart with that, or it will not restart with that user.
Right. It is funny, now that I think about that, how many instances I've seen that have actually been the service account is some employee account.
Yep.
For whatever reason that happened. The other one there in admin setup is server defaults. And so again, we're talking about SQL Server settings here, something that you'd see on the advanced configuration. Again, what they should be is going to be another question, but I just want to know what has been changed. And let me compare that to either, internal documentation or, expectations of the business.
So that's where you find out that they've turned on auto shrink and auto close and those kind of features.
That's right. And I guess we should point out, right, that this is a scenario where, particularly in the newer versions of SQL Server, you can actually set some of that stuff at the database level. So difference between instance and database. But for the most part, I think a lot of those settings are in the older versions of SQL Server at the instance level. But there are things like either the shrinking or the closing of connections and whatnot that can still be at the database level.
Yep. Okay. On to security then. I mean, the biggest thing that usually comes up on security is sysadmin privileges.
Yes. And again, so this is domain or the instance perspective, right? Who else has sysadmin privileges on there? Because at the end of the day, they can do anything they want. And that could be good or bad. So we just want to make sure that if we're responsible, if we are now the person tied to that server, they need to get clearance from us. We need to be okay with that idea. And if we're not, push back on it.
Yep.
I think this is very common, particularly when we have third-party applications where they're like, oh, just give sysadmin, which I know can kind of be a pain sometimes. But I think Microsoft, as much as gripe or as much complaining as we like to do sometimes about some of the security, they have gone to great pains to try to make some of these roles available. I know a lot of times we see, for example, in monitoring tools, right? They want DBO or, sysadmin rights when, view system state, view server state will get them what they need.
Right. But I think it's far easier when asked what permissions are needed for a specific application for someone to respond with, they just need sysadmin privileges.
That's right. Because you won't go wrong, right? There won't be any problems at that point.
Yep. But it's not the greatest thing to do. So.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So I like to look at that as how many sysadmin logins do we really have? Is every single user a sysadmin?
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is, do we have just one?
Yeah.
And then the flip side of that is, do we have just one SA login? And is that the only login to the entire database? I know I've seen that a few times. We don't need users. We just use the SA login for everyone.
Yeah. Again, so those are the things that we're going to want to document and then potentially defend or say, hey, we need to make a change here.
Yep. And I know that's oftentimes, changing the login process, especially if everyone is sharing an account, can be very challenging to do because sometimes it requires code changes or configuration file changes or things like that to straighten out eventually. But at least getting an understanding of what it is a good spot to be, because then you know who can hurt the server.
Right. Well, even then, I think, so let's just say in that scenario that the application is using the one account, might be a little bit cumbersome, but not maybe as cumbersome as changing all of the application, connection information, but at least creating additional accounts for the people that connect, use SQL Server Management Studio, things like that, so that at least you can take the password for that application account and put it somewhere where not everybody has it.
Right.
Right. It's a little harder to get to, that type of thing.
Yeah. And the place that it's harder to get to shouldn't be in the source code that all the developers have access
to. That's also true.
Yeah. I remember for security on a company I was working for a couple of years ago, and it took months just to straighten out all of the server permissions because, all the login privileges, because prior to that happening, nobody there had really cared about things being secure on that server. It was simply one SA login, and that was good enough for the owners.
It's good enough for me, right?
Yeah.
So the next area we want to look at are dependencies, right? So these are objects in the database that the database is going to use, or the application is going to use. And again, we just want to know a bit about them. So the first one is user objects in system databases.
Yep.
A lot of times, we as administrators can be the most guilty of this.
I know I've done that. I've connected to a database and with the intention of using a specific database, but then accidentally created a stored procedure in the master database.
Sure. And
one way I help prevent that is don't use the master database as your default database.
Right. Yeah, if you don't have another database and on a new server, that can be difficult because I'm even thinking about some of the community scripts, right? So SPHU is active, the Blitz scripts. They're going to default to the master database.
Yep.
And so, if you don't have one, that might be something to think about as you start investigating, or at least being aware, of some of those things. Now, again, it's a little bit easier because you're creating them, you can clean them up. But if there are other objects in there, we want to know why, right? And this is all in an effort because of recovery, right? If that database is dependent on an object in the master database that doesn't get restored, if we have to move it to a new server, then all of a sudden I have problems and I may not know why. Database that doesn't get restored, if we have to move it to a new server, then all of a sudden I have problems and I may not know why.
Yep. Next thing to look at there oftentimes is triggers. What are the tables that have lots of triggers or complex triggers on them?
Yeah, exactly. And this is just information so that I know that when I insert a table or I do X, then something else is going to happen. There's another component involved there. I know a lot of times I feel like the admin audit, so that it seems like there's a pretty popular trigger out there, so that when administrators do things like create tables or create databases or change users, that information gets audited and put into another table. Well, I've had instances where all of a sudden that database is not available, the trigger starts failing, and then you have issues, right?
Are slow, so there's a triggers to think about there. One is just your traditional triggers that are on tables for when things change, when things are inserted, updated, or deleted.
Sure.
Then you have the DDL type triggers, like you had just mentioned, administrators adding a table or changing a table. But then you also have login triggers that can be set up on the database.
That's also true.
That's one that I came across not too long ago, where wondering why our logins are so slow. Well, every time somebody was logging in, it was inserting a row into a table, and that had been running on a database for more than 10 years. And that login table had never been purged. It was one of those I asked, well, do you really care who logged into the database 5 years ago or 2 years ago? And then we ended up getting rid of the trigger eventually. But for the short-term fix was to just truncate the table because they didn't care about it.
Sure.
And things were suddenly fast again.
And that's another great example I learned an example because I feel like most of the time when we get in trouble with triggers, it's because we as administrators are trying to outthink ourselves a little bit there. Right? Because, in that scenario, like, let me put a trigger for login because for whatever reason, that was a requirement. I thought about it. I learned about it. And let me implement this because I think it's going to help me. And then it can come back to bite us because we forget about it. The database changes, hands, ownership. Yeah, so that's another good one just to take a peek at.
And some of those aren't entirely obvious until you run into a problem.
Oh, exactly.
Yep.
Another one, and again, so this is, I guess, more at the database level, but going through each of those databases and then looking for disabled indexes. So we talked a little bit about the bulk log scenario. So cases when I have large imports, data warehouses, sometimes the indexes can be disabled until the finishes, and then they can get re-enabled or rebuilt. The index can be used. Every once in a while, however, in that process, the job fails, or for whatever reason, the indexes aren't re-enabled. Those are other things we're going to want to take a peek at because basically we're storing data that SQL Server can't use anymore. And do we want to use it? Do we want to get rid of it? Those are kind of questions we want to start asking with disabled indexes.
Yep. It's just overhead that's not used for anything at that point. Right. And maybe you should be using it, or maybe you should be getting rid of it. It really depends.
Exactly.
So then we also want to take a look at non-trusted foreign keys and constraints. And that can cause some interesting trouble where both around data integrity and around performance.
No, exactly. I think when we think we have that foreign key and we think, okay, we're straight. And again, the foreign keys are going to help us. They hurt us a little bit on the insert because it has to do that. That's why they got disabled. They hurt us a little bit on the insert because it has to do that lookup. So we get that. And that's probably why they got disabled because, again, lots of bulk, inserts, things like that. But then when we're trying to do our queries, and particularly the big queries where we're joining lots of tables, even though the foreign key is there, SQL Server is going to go about giving you that query differently because the foreign key is no longer trusted. And you're going to get different results based on that. And so, again, that's information we're going to want to know about.
Yep. And sometimes that different result can be a change in the query plan that goes from like a full table scan on a table versus not even touching that table based off of those trusted foreign keys.
Exactly. And then the last one, again, we want to be aware of is plan guides, right? So SQL Server is going to look to those plan guides, going to implement them in the query plans.
But the other thing to consider with plan guides too is if somebody went gangbusters and added too many plan guides, there are some issues around plan guides and being able to change stored procedure code for stored procedures that have plan guides attached to them.
Oh, gotcha.
Created for them. So if you have plan guides that have been added, for instance, on a vendor supplied database, and you're doing an update from the vendor to that database, you may need to go through and disable your plan guides prior to doing the update and then put them back in after doing an update. Plan guides, although I kind of think of them as the in case of emergency thing, where
Right.
you only use them sparingly, but you'd better make sure that everyone knows about them because they do have other ramifications that might not be entirely apparent when you use them.
And I think that this is going to increase because, again, in the newer versions of SQL Server with the query store, if we've gone in, and again, so the query, the whole premise of this is I'm using a plan that's less efficient. I want to go back and use this other plan. Well, I'm oversimplifying this, right? So, but basically we're putting in, I guess not really a plan guide, but we are putting in some information to say, hey, use this instead of what you think is right. And again, those are going to be things that we're going to want to know about. We may have done them, we may have executed them, or somebody else may have, but we're going to want to be aware that a change was made for whatever reason.
Yep. And it sort of brings me back to one of my peeves about SQL Server, and I probably should have answered this as what would I change in SQL Server if I could. But there's two terms that I really despise.
Oh, here we go.
And one of them is the term plan, but there's two terms that I really despise.
Oh, here we go.
And one of them is the term plan guides, and the other one is the term query hints. They should be called plan commands.
Sure.
Or plan. It's not a guide like, oh, we recommend you do this. It's a command that says you will always do it this way.
Right.
And the thing with query hints is they're not hints like, oh, you might try this. They are commands that say you will do this. So Anyway, sorry, side rant there on nomenclature, but just guides are not guides. They are commands that say it will happen this way. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at plan guides.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're going to start seeing more of those, like I mentioned, in newer versions. And then the last area we're going to touch on is now. So now that we've kind of done all of that, right? We can now start taking a peek at some of the performance related things. Now we did mention, right, that
used or not
the metrics around performance, and I think ultimately what we're talking about here is establishing baselines.
Yep, and this can apply instance wide, or it can apply to a single database, either way, depending on what it is you're looking at there. And I mean, with query stats, being able to have a baseline to understand what queries are causing the most weight statistics.
Yep.
What indexes are being used or not being used. What files for that database or instance are being overloaded or have very little I/O on them. And I think that understanding that can have a huge impact on the way you look at things when you go to troubleshoot that server later.
No, exactly. And I think, again, with the file stats, just because I think it is one of those, it was eye-opening for me. And let's say you have an instance and you introduce a new database, right? So obviously the file stats on day one should be 0, right? Or near 0, whatever. Well, then you turn that thing on and you want to take a peek at it over time, and you may find out that all of a sudden this thing's going to be, it's very chatty. It's going to be a big hog, and now you're going to start having problems. And so again, establishing what those things are, and we mentioned a couple: the queries, the index, and the file stats, weight stats. I guess we should include in there as well, as to where am I now, and then what am I doing in a week, in a month, in a quarter, that kind of a thing. And of course, this is again where the third-party tools come into play to capturing that information. For most of this, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are things out there already that will do that, and database SelfMonitor is one of them. One additional item that I guess we should talk about when it comes to investigating databases, and that's different from the instance level, is actually taking a peek at the database diagrams. And this could be kind of hit or miss. I mean, I think the diagrams are helpful, but the tools that we have natively aren't great at helping us with this.
Right. I like to stay away from the database diagrams in SQL Server Management Studio. And I think we talked about this many episodes ago, but the reason I don't like that is that people like to use it kind of like Visio to be able to make some changes and diagram things and print it out.
Right.
But so many times I've seen that people don't realize that when you go into database diagrams and start drawing lines, that's actually making changes to the database and adding foreign keys.
Right. Live editor.
Yep. Live editor. And I've seen that cause problems so many times. I generally say, stay away from that. What I like to do, if I want to look at a database diagram, is I like to use Visio. And Visio on certain versions and certain, I don't remember the exact Visio Enterprise or Visio, I don't remember the exact version.
Yeah, it went through a weird transition where it wasn't there for a little while. I guess you could still reverse engineer it, but some of the database objects, I think it was 2012, had a, because this harkens back to our Ken episode on the SQL Server data tools, right? When they were doing that transition, this also was affected by that.
Right. So with Visio, I like to be able to go in and just either on a smaller database, take all the tables and import those into Visio so you can see where all the foreign keys are. Or if it's a larger database, just bring in a subset of the tables that might be around specific areas that you're looking at, bring it into Visio, and that way you can visualize it. And if you have access to like a large size plotter, it's really kind of handy to be able to print it out and have like a poster size diagram of the database on your wall. And I'm not really big in favor of wasting paper, but that's a really useful way so that when people come to talk to you about a database, you can just stand up and go to the diagram on the wall and make sure you're both discussing the same thing.
Right. I love that idea, right? And I think this also harkens back to the idea of, is this a third-party app or is this something that we're developing in-house? I think the third-party app there might still be some use for that, but definitely the in-house development. I mean, I don't know how many conversations I've settled just because we pop it up in the database diagram and okay, look, this is what I'm talking about. Is that what you're talking about? Oh no, I'm talking about this thing. Okay, well, there you go. Now, I have never had access to the plotter, right? We've always had to go to like Kinko's or whatever, and they're never quite big enough, or we're piecing them together, right? And all this legal paper, and we have to tape it together. So I have migrated beyond that. I think, at least my experience has been the database diagrams are only as helpful as the culture of your environment. Meaning that if you're willing to use them and look to them and adopt them as like a change management process, they become much more helpful. If it's something that you don't care about and you're not like you're making changes to the database without the diagram first being updated, then it becomes less helpful, right? Almost like source control type idea.
Right. Yep.
And so because of that, I've kind of moved on even past Visio, and I like the Embarcadero tool. It is, it's expensive. It's like Irwin. So Irwin was kind of the cream of the crop. Embarcadero kind of came in, tried to come in underneath, provides lots of the same functionalities. I think one of the things that you suffer from, like in Visio, is particularly once you get beyond, like, let's just say 10 tables, description. Maybe it's very, very helpful.
Yep.
But again, still, it is helpful, I think, in the biggest ways in one, are data types, relationships, and then understanding where things go, right? So again, that idea of diagramming, this is my table, this is an object. What's going to go in this object? Oh, okay, well, you're describing something that doesn't quite match that description. Maybe it should go over in this different table, or we need to think about that differently.
Yep. Oh, yeah. I can think of an interesting story where I was working with a client a few years ago where we were working on some reporting queries and trying to figure out how to do some tuning or how to get the data that they needed in there. And so I went in and I thought, okay, well, I don't understand this database. It's a third-party vendor that provided it. The first thing I did is I opened it up and I started looking at foreign keys, and I realized that there was not a single foreign key on the over 200 plus tables in the entire database. I'll use that 100 plus tables in the entire database.
And you're like, yes.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, well, the only thing we have at that point to try and guess what is intended to be treated as a foreign key is just how things are being used in queries. And I found that there were a lot of places that people were joining on values that shouldn't have been joined on, and wondering why they didn't work. And if there had just been foreign keys in the database, it would have made a lot more sense to someone trying to get an understanding of what you can join on.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, so Cody, hopefully that's helpful, right? So I guess to kind of recap a little bit there, if we go back and put in some of those groupings. So first is system availability. Then we have admin setup. We want to take a look at security, dependencies, and then performance. I guess we should add, we've shared a couple of different stories there about how to do that. But again, a lot of that's going to just depend on your culture and whatnot.
Yeah, so I guess I just want to say thanks, Cody, for the great question. It gave us a good topic for this episode. And Carlos, I don't think we have our next 100 episodes entirely booked out yet, do we?
Not yet. We are shy by just, 99 or so.
Yeah. So, and I guess the reason I bring that up is if anybody has any questions or ideas or topics that you'd like to have us cover in the podcast, let us know, just like Cody did here. And we'll be happy to consider it for the podcast episodes.
No, that's right. I guess, so speaking of the future, Tracy Bojano, who is going to be speaking at the Compañero conference, she'll be on next week. And then we have Eugene Meinger. I'm pretty sure I'm saying that last name right. I told myself I would say it right next time I said it, and I'm not sure I did that. But he's going to be on the program as well.
And speaking of the conference,
or
SQL Data,
be on the program as well.
And speaking of the conference,
we just have over 100 days to go. And so we're looking forward to it. You can still register at compañeroconference.com. August 4th and 5th, we'll be down in Norfolk, and we hope to see you there.
Yep, I'm certainly looking forward to it.
Yes. So again, if you want to check out the show notes for today's episode, that will be at SQLDataPartners.com/newdb.
Or SQLDataPartners.com/101.
Of course, we'd really enjoy you reaching out to us on social media. You can do that on Twitter or at LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon.
And on LinkedIn, I'm at Steve Stedman. And on Twitter, at SQLEMT.
SQL Data Partners.